All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Andrew Cockburn. He is the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine, and he wrote a bunch of great books about the old Soviet Union and about Iraq and about Donald Rumsfeld and about the military-industrial complex, the drone wars, and he also has a Substack because he is a writer, and it's 2024. Welcome to the show. How you doing, Andrew?
Great to be with you. I'm doing fine.
Great. Now, I just got to figure out where's my tab with your Substack on it, because, man, I've got so many tabs. Here it is. You know, I quote you all the time about this. The neoconservatives. Who's a neocon? What's a neocon? And all the time people just go, oh, I don't like that guy. He's a neocon. But wait, there's a specific definition here of a neocon. It's kind of a biographical description of a very few people. I would wager it's less than 100 people if you counted them all. You could go to the Militarist Monitor, formerly Right Web, and count them off on your fingers. And I bet you stop before 100 guys. And then, but what you taught me, and I don't remember if this is in the book, Rumsfeld, or you just said this to me on the radio back 20 years ago or whatever, or what you said was the neoconservative movement is the cross between the Israel lobby and the military-industrial complex. And so here's your article, brand new today at Spoils of War. And that's the name of the last book, by the way, Spoils of War. And that's the Substack. And it's spoilsofwar.substack.com. And the article is called The Birth of the Neocons. Yes, indeed, it was all in the aid of the Pentagon budget. So take us back in time, Andrew Cockburn, and set us straight. Who's a neocon and what's a neocon?
Well, you said it. It's the fusion of the defense lobby, the military-industrial complex, with the Israel lobby. And it was we have to go further back in time. Traditionally, I mean, way back, up through the 1960s, the Israel lobby, although hard over on anything with respect to Israel, was otherwise rather dovish. You know, Lyndon Johnson used to complain that they wouldn't support him on Vietnam. He kept saying, I've done so much for Israel, every which way, which he certainly had, like giving the go-ahead for the 1967 war and covering up the Liberty atrocity and all the rest. And he would have liked to have had their support for his Vietnam adventure, but he didn't get it. So then, moving forward into the 1970s, and specifically around about the mid-70s, the end of the Vietnam War, when things looked a little, not that dark, but a little shady for the defense complex. I mean, they just had an enormous war, which of course they'd lost. And, they'd had 500,000 troops in Vietnam and all the rest, an enormous boom in war production, but all that was had come to an end. And so there was the grim prospect of the defense budget actually going down. In fact, it did dip a little bit. So along comes a very important gentleman called Paul Nitze. And Paul Nitze's had a huge effect on our history, on this fate of this country and potentially the fate of the world, because he was the author of NSC 68, which was the founding document really for the Cold War, for the sort of militarization of our economy in response to an alleged Soviet threat in 1950. He prepared this document, or he oversaw it, and that really kicked off the big boom in defense spending that has gone on ever since. So Nitze, in the mid-70s, he saw that there was this awkward problem, which was the Israel lobby was not supporting the defense lobby. And he decided to put that to rights. And all my information on this comes actually, I'm the only person who's ever sort of written about this, because I had a good source in the form of a guy called Scott Thompson, who was at that time, well, had been in the 1970s, was Nitzer's son-in-law, who's married to his daughter, and was also his sort of close aide, and also worked in the Pentagon. He was an aide to Defense Secretary Schlesinger, and then after that to the dreaded Rumsfeld. So Scott really knew what he was talking about, and he laid it all out for me. He said Nitzer wanted to fuse the Israel lobby, particularly a group called Democrats for Coalition for a Democratic Majority, which was a sort of proto-neocon group. It was a bunch of Israel supporters, particularly a guy called Norman Podhoretz and his wife Midge Decter, and there was to sort of bolster support among Democrats for Israel. And Nitzer's brainwave was to fuse these two groups, this group with the defense lobby, of which he was a tried and true leader. And so he set up a thing called the Committee on the Present Danger, which was superficially was to raise the alarm about the Soviet threat. But very significantly, the founding members, you can see what it was all about. You look at the sort of three leading founding members: Nitzer himself, Eugene Rostow, former Undersecretary of State, who was a fanatical Zionist, really sort of hard over, and a guy called Charles Walker, who was the premier lobbyist of his time, particularly for defense corporations. So as Scott explained to me, and this is borne out if you look at the sort of membership and the money flow, Walker's job was to supply the defense money to support this committee, and Rostow brought along the pro-Israel people, and Nitzer sort of banged the drum for the Soviet threat. And it worked like gangbusters. And I should say, they then recruited all sorts of people who became the neocons. In fact, one of them was a guy called Richard Allen, who was later Ronald Reagan's first national security advisor. He said, we were the original neocon. We were the real neoconservatives. He told this to me. I interviewed him about this, and he bragged about it. And there were also coming along with people like Rumsfeld, Ronald Reagan himself, who was governor, people like Max Kampelman, who was a very powerful corporate lawyer and trusty defender of Israel. And then you had the people, low lives like the Wolfowitz, Paul Wolfowitz, Lane Kirkland, who was the head of the AFL-CIO, who was a very, very staunch Israel supporter, and also staunch supporter of ever bigger defense budgets for, I guess, obvious reasons. And it really worked well. In fact, I quote Les Aspin, who was people have forgotten him now, but he was a Democratic congressman who was like a sort of supposedly an expert on defense of a sort of dovish kind, but he certainly knew a lot about what was going on in the defense business. And he actually said in 1977, he says the Israel lobby is no longer in favor of reducing the defense budget. It had worked. They were no longer, they'd lost their dovish stance. And by 1982, the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, premier, Zionist group, he actually wrote a book in which he said, old-fashioned anti-Semitism is no longer a problem in America. The new anti-Semitism is people who is the peaceniks, people who are against defense spending. So, what greater victory could Nitzer have hoped for? That now opposing the defense budget was anti-Semitism. So there you have it.
Yeah, there are two quotes of two of the Godfathers, Podhoretz and Crystal, were from the mid-'70s, where they say, listen, anybody who loves Israel has to support American interventionism overall. We have to
Yeah,
keep a strong America so that it's available to protect Israel. They both say virtually the
yeah,
same thing. And now this marriage that you're talking about where all these groups got together, this is the mid 70s, right? So during the
yeah.
Carter years, still in the
It was actually
preparation for
officially
Reagan, right?
it was officially set up in 1976,
Hmm.
but actually Alan told me that they were hard at work before then. They announced it
Yeah.
right after the 1976 election.
And when you say
Uh,
Wolfowitz and the scum, you're talking about the guys from the University of Chicago who had been all working for Scoop Jackson, the Democrat senator from Washington State, or as they call them, the senator from Boeing. And then,
yeah,
yeah, Jim Loeb tells this story too about how, well, and this is, legendarily Podhoretz had written about how much hated black people and all that stuff. So there was it was essentially like the Truman Democrats, and there's a big overlap with the Zionists there, who were reacting against the new left, who were against Vietnam, pro-civil rights, and sided with the Palestinians, or at least did not overtly side with Israel in the 67 war. And so they said, well, if this is who Democrats are now, then we're moving to the right. And then what's interesting, right, is they don't make their alliance with the kind of rhinos in the middle. They make their alliance with the conservatives and join into the Reagan administration.
yeah. I mean, Podhoretz, just as a footnote, I mean, he'd been quite a sort of active, I guess, in opposing the Vietnam War in the 60s. I mean, you can gauge the swing, the extent of the swing from that. I mean, he said, that all went away, of course. But yeah, the Crystals, the Podhoretzes, and then, of course, it became generational, From,
Jude Wanniski once told me, and he was, by the time I met him, he was ex-neocon. So he had been a leftist, and then he had become a Reaganite hawk, and then he had become more of a paleocon like Pat Buchanan. But he was like a monetarist, economist type. And he told me that, oh, I'm so embarrassed because, and I'm really sorry because I'm the one who introduced Richard Pearl to Dick Cheney.
oh, really?
And
That's a terrible thing to have in your conscience.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah,
The confluence there.
Pearl was, he worked for Jackson, and also, look at like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, from New York. I think he was very much of this ilk, sort of, a great quote unquote liberal unquote, and yet fanatical in his support for Zionism, and he was very much, and actually. Oddly enough, Pat Buchanan, I think, takes credit for, or took credit for having, I found a thing where he'd urged, in 1972, he'd urged Moynihan to, I have to look it up while we're talking, to say, you could do yourself a lot of good by, saying we need military, defense, dollar for defense is a dollar for Israel.
Yeah. That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, Pat is always an anti-communist first, and so it was really with the end of the Cold War was when he said, okay, now we can give up the empire. The emergency's over, and so now we don't have to defend the world from communism anymore. But up until then, he was all about facing down them Reds, whatever it took, and including,
Sure.
I still think last I heard, he still was in favor of Vietnam and thought that was the right thing to at least try to do there and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he was Nixon's guy, so he's loyal to the end. But yeah, it was, he opposed Iraq War I. He was like, what are we doing? Now we're going to take advantage of the Soviets getting out of our way? That's not the deal. The deal was that we come home now. What are we,
Yeah.
Which was, you would think would have been the reaction of the American people, but instead it was like, oh yeah, USA, we're number one. Let's go beat up on a weakling. We can do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it was in the name of beating up a bully, right? The bully was Saddam, and we were saving the poor Kuwaitis, Andrew. Did you hear?
Oh, right. Yeah. Those poor hapless Kuwaitis. And actually, well, this is something else I've been working on, the degree to which Saddam always believed in conspiracies, and people. There's a new book about him where people, he's kind of derided for his sort of, silly Middle Eastern belief in conspiracy theories. But actually, he was, we were the ones who gave him the go-ahead to attack Iran, which is really sort of ultimately led to his downfall because it bankrupted Iraq. And down the line, I mean, there was so much manipulation went on. Sorry, I'm drifting off the subject, but
no, it's important.
Yeah, this is it. Pat Buchanan, since we were talking about this, this is a detailed memo on White House strategy for the 1972 election, co-authored by Pat Buchanan, suggested that Defense Secretary Melvin Laird should speak out on what effect cuts in the Navy's budget proposed by George McGovern would have on Israel. Quote, with the conclusion, not unjustified, that the future of Israel, the survival of Israel, with McGovern's naval cuts, will be the decision of the Soviet Politburo. Well, that sounds like Pat. Yeah.
So well, it is the case that Israel was fighting against nation states back then, not just bombing civilians to bits. So, there's a little bit more of an argument there. And again, when everything is about a showdown with the Soviets, then it is what it is. We love you, Pat. I don't know if Pat listens to the show, but we love you.
Yeah. What can we say?
Yeah. On the Kuwait thing, I argue in the book that I really don't think it was a conspiracy. I bet if Saddam Hussein, looking through his eyes, it certainly was. But it looked to me like just left hand, right hand, don't know what they're doing kind of, Republican politics, where I think it was the CIA and DIA were telling the Kuwaitis to be tough and intransigent. Mm-hmm. And then the State Department was telling Saddam Hussein, go ahead and kick their ass, see if I care. And then at the Defense Department, Wolfowitz and Cheney, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy at the time, I guess. And they were warning, oh my God, Saddam's serious, we got to stop him. And they had Bush send a letter to Saddam. And then Wolfowitz was like, no, the letter's not tough enough. The letter even reads like permission. And so they had him send another one. And by then the tanks were rolling in. So it was so
it's also though, they someone like Chas Freeman, who was the U.S. ambassador in Saudi Arabia at the time, he told me that he could see that Saddam was up to something that was, likely to be, he would believe what Saddam was saying about Kuwait. And he kept trying to sort of tell the State Department that, look, you better pay attention to this. And he said he couldn't get their attention. He was told to shut up, basically. So
well, April Glaspie said to the New York Times that, look, nobody thought he was going to take the whole country. In other words, conceding that, yes, the idea was go ahead and take the northern oil fields. They're overproducing from shared oil wells and supposedly slant drilling and all this. Well, go in there and break their knees then. But not take the whole country. And then Margaret Thatcher freaked out. She was the one who had the problem. And then, because, even the first 3 days, Colin Powell said, we should just draw the line at Saudi Arabia. They chaired like the National Security Council meeting. And they said, we should just tell him, don't you dare roll down to Saudi or we will bomb the crap out of you. But as far as Kuwait, we don't really care. And that was the consensus for the first 3 days until Thatcher called Bush a wimp and said, don't go wobbly. And then they escalated after that.
Yeah, that's what happened.
What a shame. That whole thing. By the way, this conversation came up earlier. Let me ask you about this because I was just in ninth grade at the time and I never heard of any revisionism about this. Bill Hicks kind of said allegedly, but I didn't know anything more about it than that. But it turns out there's a Seymour Hersh article about it. But what I'm interested in is what you guys knew at the time about the alleged assassination attempt against Bush Sr. in '93. Did everybody really believe in that? Or did everybody like you and Gareth Porter and whoever who are in the know, did you guys all know that was a hoax all along or what?
Yeah, well, I relied on my brother Patrick, who was I think he was either in Iraq or, was following it very closely. He was the one who I think got Hirsch to write about it, or inspired Hirsch to write about it, that yeah, there was obvious, there was clearly these whiskey smugglers who were meant to have been plotting the assassination had confessions beaten out of them by the Kuwaitis, who had every incentive to, serve this kind of thing up.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think no one took it very seriously. Even as I recall, memory's a bit hazy now, but even the Bush people didn't take it very seriously. It was only later on when young George was looking for some excuse to, invade. He started talking about they tried to kill my dad and all that.
Yeah. So that's my idea. Is that I think most people believe that that's true. Most people who've ever heard of it think that, like, as far as they know, nobody ever disputed that. When really Seymour Hersh totally debunks it. As you say, it was just a whiskey smuggling ring that they embellished into this thing. And then my favorite anecdote out of there, and this just seals the case, is that the same guy who pushed this lie is the same guy whose daughter claimed that she had seen the babies thrown out of the incubators.
The Kuwaiti ambassador.
Guy. Yeah, it's literally 2 years later.
Yeah.
3 years later. Is the same character coming up with this nonsense. And then that completely ruined, because this is like, Clinton's first 6 months here. So this completely ruined any rapprochement with Iraq after that. And it helped to push through what was the Israelis' preferred policy, was the dual containment policy of Martin Indyk, who had just founded at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the AIPAC spinoff, with a bunch of military-industrial complex money. And their idea was, nope, we'll stay in Saudi Arabia to contain Iraq and Iran both, even if that leads to us getting our towers knocked down 10 years later.
Exactly so. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. It was and Clinton never had the wit or the interest to sort of, figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
They snookered him. And as you say, it really locked in place the whole Clinton-Iraq policy from there on.
Mm-hmm. I think it was Jim Loeb that once talked about how all these different think tanks, a lot of times they're just different pieces of paper in Bill Kristol's desk drawer, right? Like he just has his secretary fill out the paperwork and they create a new think tank. This one's the Foreign Policy Initiative and this one is the committee on this and that and whatever the hell they do. And they create a new one all the time.
Yeah. It's,
builds this echo chamber effect, but it's just Bill Kristol talking to himself, him and his friends,
Yeah, Bill Kristol, who, remember, he gave us, what was her name? McCain's vice president.
Sarah Palin.
Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
He was the one who sold Sarah Palin to the Republicans.
Yep. And what was her like endearing quality? That she was a mindless war hawk. And she's like a real redneck of a rube, and the redneck rubes will love her, he thought. Like that was his calculation. He's as cynical as could be.
Right, and typical sort of Washington arrogance, the people out there, deplorables.
I don't know if you ever saw my debate with him, but he goes first, and he begins with, geez, I used to come down here to this neighborhood and play pool sometimes to sort of, kind of see how regular people live or something. Like the way he explains is so funny, dude.
Yeah.
Like he's just such an alien to the society that he's in charge of for some reason.
Yeah. Well,
so look, in your article, you begin actually with a conference call from General Dynamics where, like, after all, business is business, and you can only couch it in so many euphemisms. And they're just saying, yeah, we're making a killing on artillery shells right now. It's a investment. It's a, buyer's market. Come on in.
Right. Because, General Dynamics, they have this, wonky old factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is actually they've got the monopoly on these 155 millimeter artillery shells. They're the only American producer. And it's a typical, defense and, modern defense operation, i.e., it hasn't been properly maintained. They can't meet their production targets. One of the reasons that the Ukrainians are going under is down to the fact that this creaky old factory can't produce enough shells or hasn't done.
Mm-hmm. And why is it that they have a monopoly? Is it really like a license issue? Because you would think that they would be offering these contracts to anybody who could fill them now.
Well, it takes a while to sort of, to put a, it's quite a complicated business making these artillery shells. So you can't just sort of take over an empty factory or run up a factory and and build them. And you've got to remember that, the defense complex is a whole series of monopolies now. I mean, this is what happened, the fateful thing that happened in the 1990s with William Perry. They organized this whole policy implemented this whole policy of turning the whole defense. It used to be in 1991, I think there were like 50 or 55 prime defense contractors. So at least maybe, for better or worse, you had a bit of competition. But Perry slimmed the whole thing down to five major ones. Maybe you could toss in a couple more, so maybe it's 6 or 7 now. So there's like basically, Lockheed makes the fighter planes, Northrop makes the bombers, General Dynamics makes the artillery shells. A couple of other very incompetent corporations make the Navy ships. I mean, it's one of the reasons that U.S. defense is in such a poor shape. It goes back to that. You've got these monopolies who have no incentive to, and Boeing's in there too, of course, no incentive to be efficient, productive enterprises. Every incentive to gouge the taxpayer and dole it out to their shareholders.
Yeah. Hey, you guys, did you know that I don't just write books, I publish them? Well, the Institute does, and I'm the director, so yeah. 13 of them now, including my 4. We published 5 more in 2023. Lori Calhoun and Tom Wood's books about the COVID regime, Joe Solis Mullen on the fake China threat, Jim Bovard's latest, Last Rites, and our managing editor Keith Knight's Domestic Imperialism. And we've got more great titles coming in 2024. Check them out at libertarianinstitute.org/books and help support our anti-government efforts at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you. Hey, y'all, Scott here. Let me tell you about Roberts & Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Who knew? Artificial bank credit expansion leads to price inflation and terribly distorted markets. If you've got any savings left at all, you need to protect them. You need to put some, at least, into precious metals. Well, Roberts & Roberts can set you up with the best deals on silver, gold, platinum, and palladium. And they've been doing this since 1977. Hey, if you just need some sound advice about sound money, they're there for you, too. Call Tim Fry and the guys at 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760. Or check them out at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. You'll be glad you did. Now, look, I know that mostly we lose wars against peasants in their neighborhoods because our government won't resort to nuking them, but we can't quite win them over with machine guns no matter how hard we try. And so we're used to losing wars like that. Vietnam, the entire Middle East, for example. But the idea is, and boy, if you read Defense News and Defense One and the Washington Times, or like UPI 2, sort of, you know what I mean? There's that second UPI feed that's just all military industrial complex news and stuff. You read all this stuff, and this is just in the popular press. I know it's like this in all the journals and whatever too, where they just go on and on and on about what it would be like to fight Russia and or China, and just presuming. They never even discuss it a lot of times. They just leave out and presume no one's going to use any nukes in the thing. It'll strictly be a fair fist fight, and we'll just fight a conventional war. And then the idea is then we can really unleash all of our cool bombers and ships and planes and all these things that are essentially useless against, Pashtun tribesmen in the Helmand province and stuff. But we could, in a war versus another military like Russia or China, I mean, we could have a lot of fun, like a World War II movie or something, where it's really exciting and really big, important explosions happen and stuff. And they really talk like that a lot, but never even mind the nukes. Never even mind the nukes. I
But the
kind
thing
of
is,
wonder whether they could even take the Russians or the Chinese, or really they do nothing but blow smoke. And those F-35s would just fall right out of the sky if they were ever really put to the test.
well, here's the thing. I mean, they should be realizing, maybe it's dawning on them that, that they really, Ukraine has shown just what a disaster we have in, our defense system is. I mean, we've sent, you see more and more of this leaking out. Like, we sent them our best drones, and the Russians just jammed them, and they fell out of the sky. It's useless. We sent them our tip-top air defense missile, the Patriot. Well, that doesn't seem to be doing so well.
Oh, and the Abrams tank, which you're an expert in. Talk about that.
Well, the Abrams tank, we sent them 31 Abrams tanks. And the Ukrainians have had to pull them out of the line because they keep being knocked out. If they even get to the line, because they break down so often. The thing is a joke. It needs an entire separate fuel system because it runs it has a gas turbine engine, so it needs a different kind of fuel. Not like diesel that everything else runs on. It has these filters to stop dust getting in, to jam the engine, but the filters keep having to be changed. Even when they've got the fuel, they run out of fuel. It's got very short legs. It runs out of fuel very, very fast, and you need a whole separate supply train to keep it going. I think that the Russians put one on display in Moscow just a week or so ago. They had a whole lineup of captured NATO supplied weaponry, and there was an Abrams tank in there. So it's this is our premier tank, and seems it hasn't done well at all.
This is so fun. Look, I mean, I know you're you, but from this point of view, it's just great that you're the guy who wrote the book on how the Russian military, the Soviet military back in the 1980s was really a paper tiger, and their tanks were pieces of junk, and they didn't have any gasoline or skills, and they would lose their right arm loading the shell into the thing, into the breech, and all this stuff, and then the whole thing fell apart. What, like 7 years after that book came out? 6 years after that book came out, the Soviet Union began to cease to exist, and then, and now you're going, oh yeah, Scott, the American tanks, paper tiger. What we were going to meet them with.
Pretty much of a paper tiger then.
Yeah, same thing, right? Because it's the Abrams tanks are from that era, right?
That's right.
So that's what we would have met them with in the Fulda Gap in '85 if it had come down to it.
That's right. I remember making a film about this in 1979. God help me, shows how old I am. But it's not just the tanks. Like, we sent them all our, most of our huge quantity of our 155 artillery pieces, not just the shells, but the actual cannons. Turns out they wear out in a hurry. They're very delicate. They're very high tech and lots of electronics involved, and the barrels wear out quite fast. It's been true of all the European guns they've sent too. It hasn't really sunk in much over here yet. What a disaster. I mean, how much Ukraine has shown up, how badly off we are in terms of defense. That they didn't, we were very proud. We sent the Ukrainians these GPS guided bombs, which are brilliantly accurate and everything. But the Russians, turned out the Russians had thought of jammers. So they're being jammed. The GPS signal gets jammed and they go off target. It's the same with these, HIMARS, precision long range missiles that we're sending them. That same thing happens with them. There's been some successes, but generally it's been pretty much a disaster. So I think the people you're talking about who are rooting for the big grown-up war with the Russians and the Chinese should be a bit careful what they wish for.
Yeah, seriously. And especially and this is the thing that they willfully ignore because it takes all the fun out of it, which is that, no, we can't ever fight them because it almost certainly would go nuclear within 4 or 7 days or something. So you just can't. And
When you have these crazy, it's very odd. I'm sure you've been watching this. The more and more as things look bleaker on the Ukrainian front, more and more you're having, talk about sending, French Macron's been talking about sending French troops to Ukraine. And just the other day, Hakeem Jeffries, minority Democrat, minority leader in the House, the Democratic leader there, he said it's quite likely, or not, I can't remember the exact phrase. Did you catch it? When he talked about the likelihood that we would be getting and sending troops to Ukraine if things start to go south there.
yeah, it's just crazy. And then, of course, when the French are talking like this, the Russians, I don't know if they announced them or they already are holding these military exercises, nuclear exercises.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, you would think that they would take that seriously, but they just don't. They think a nuclear deterrent means that they can do whatever they want, not that they better not, because they should be deterred because the other side has nukes too. They just turn it inside out. Like it's just a shield that means that they could just pick any fight and no one will dare to resist them.
Mind you, we have nuclear exercises all the time too. It's like this has been taken as a sign of Putin's irresponsibility and
Well, he included Belarus in the thing. I mean, it was, and I think the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense said that this was in reaction to what Macron had said about the possibility of putting troops there, and I guess because Cameron, who's now the defense minister, the former prime minister, now defense minister, David Cameron, had talked about, well, the Ukrainians had the right to hit Russia with the weapons we give them. And the Russians said, oh, yeah, well, maybe we'll hit Britain. How do you like that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, such a ridiculous statement. I mean, the British, they really are a joke these days. I mean, they've got, a tiny army, and they like to behave like it's still, Victoria's empire or something. I think it was someone said the other day, you listen to the Brits and they all think they're Palmerston, who was the big imperialist British prime minister in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, as ever, part of the real problem here, and this goes for Palestine or any of them, I mean, look at Afghanistan. They stayed in what was obviously, in hindsight, now everyone has to agree, like the worst, stupidest thing we should have never done. They stuck with that for 20 years because they just can't admit how stupid and wrong they were last week when they said that it was right to do. And so none of them can admit that they pushed things too far in Ukraine, which is what led to the loss of Crimea and the outbreak of war in the East back, 10 years ago. And that, that's what's led to this, and that because they share at least a little responsibility that like maybe that means that they should find some kind of reasonable accommodation here, some kind of thing. But instead, no, it's like Superman versus Lex Luthor, and they know that they're the heroes and they got to defeat the bad guys and they won't stop. And I don't want to give them that much credit, but I listen to what they say and they seem so self-righteous that you know what I mean? Like, that's really all they need to know is that they're the heroes in this thing, and there's no doubt in their mind.
There's an important point, though, which it's worth mentioning, which is, you were talking earlier about they keep losing these wars to, tribesmen and so forth. And I wonder if in a way they really care, that they, there's a story I'm sure I've told you and I've repeated umpteen times. A friend of mine who was present at a meeting as a sort of aide of a meeting of a group of senior generals, 4-stars, around the time when, remember, Trump had a mini surge in Afghanistan, like around 2018. Anyway, he did.
Beginning in August of 17, yeah.
17, sorry. Okay. And he was, and they were discussing this. It had just been announced, and they were all agreeing that this is utterly pointless and, wasn't going to make any difference. And, but they said it will help. The quote was, what my friend was hearing was, it'll get our men blooded and it'll do us a lot of good at budget time. So that's the point. That, I mean, it's about getting a few of their men killed. They don't care about that. But what they do care about is, budget, the budget time, and that's what all this is in service of. Winning the war is kind of, almost beside the point.
Yeah. That rings a bell. And now I'm like, man, that better be in my book. Because I think I do remember knowing that at one point, but I remember if I knew that while I was writing my book about Afghanistan or not.
I think it probably
that's such a good one.
Encyclopedic, so
it might be in there. I hoard those type of statements. You know what I mean? Those little things, they add up and paint one hell of a picture, when it comes to all these things. I got quite a few of them where they talk about, Afghanistan as a team building mission for NATO because it needs something to do, or else people, and they would say this outright in English, or else people will question why we need it. So we have to give it something to do,
Exactly.
And that's crazy. All of them. And at such risk, I still can't believe I'm shocked but not surprised, whatever, but it's still amazing every day that they're keeping this war going, this extremely hot proxy war, this horror show of a war, people getting blown to bits, as the headlines every day over there is people getting killed in, the most violent ways, and including civilians get caught in it, and civilian infrastructure, which means a lot of suffering besides direct deaths and stuff. And right on Russia's border, 200-300 miles from Moscow, from St. Petersburg. And we're just going to keep this going, huh? And then how it's going to work out, nobody knows. The previous policy that we're going to force them all the way out in Crimea too, well, we've abandoned that. Now we're going to help them hold the line until what? I mean, and then it's like they don't even have a plan.
They don't. It is kind of shocking. We're both old enough not to be shocked by this anymore, but still, I mean, that they, we got to keep, the reason, I mean, Trump gave the okay for Johnson to let the Ukraine money through because, which seems to me what happened. I don't know what you think, but
oh yeah, absolutely. He said, "Oh, I know. How about we'll just make it a loan?" Which is, yeah, right, a guaranteed loan, meaning not a loan, a gift, but window dressing enough to get it through is exactly what happened.
Right, because they don't want to be. What neither side wants is to have to face the accusation. You lost Ukraine. So they just keep it going forever. I mean, we'll be. Come the 2028 election, we'll be hearing about who lost, so keeping the war going, so no one can say you lost Ukraine. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, I think, maybe the Ukrainians will realize, will get out from under and realize they're being had. But it's going to be an interesting 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? For the Americans too, all they have at stake is embarrassment, right? There's no accountability. Nobody's going to be in trouble for anything. Some people might make a little bit less money, and some people they won't have to admit it. They'll just have other people say that they were wrong. But we're already saying they were wrong, and they were. Yeah. That this is going to be great. Don't worry. Trust us. We're going to drive them right out of there and all of this stuff. The momentum is on Ukraine's side in the war and all their claims that they made.
Who was it? Who was it? Who most recently said, "Oh well, the Ukrainians will have a successful counteroffensive in 2025." I mean, they keep saying that. It's sort of manifest nonsense.
Yeah.
So it's another lost war.
Yeah,
this one the consequence is quite serious.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, going back to the birth of this thing 10 years ago. You were the one who had that great report. It's just a slice of life in Washington, D.C. that just seems so important. Could you tell the story about your friend who was at the party in Crystal City when the little green men took Crimea?
Oh, remind me.
Oh, yeah. You told that story about you had your friend who was at a party and it was all, Crystal City is where all the Pentagon contractors are. Right. And maybe it was like a breakfast meeting or something. The news broke that the Russians are taking over the Crimean Peninsula and everybody laughed and cheered and was happy that now we're going to
Oh,
make
yeah,
all
yeah,
this
yeah.
money and stuff.
Victoria,
That
yeah.
ring a bell?
No, it wasn't quite that. It was a friend of mine who was a lobbyist who went to a meeting. He went to a breakfast meeting for a congressman from Arkansas. Remember his name now? Big wheel in one of the defense committees on the Hill. And I saw him later that day, my friend, and I said, "What's It was just, as you said, just after the Little Green Men had taken over." And I I said, "Oh, he said he'd been at this breakfast." I said, "Who else was there?" And he said, "Well, my friend wasn't a defense lobbyist, but he said most of the people there were defense lobbyists." And I said, "Well, what was the mood? How were they reacting to the news?" He said, "I'd call the mood borderline euphoric."
Right. Yeah, I like that. Oh, I embellished all the clapping and cheering part. Borderline euphoric is good enough, though. Yeah.
Euphoria will do it.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm glad. I have the quote right in the book and the footnote. So
Okay.
I don't embellish the quote in writing, only out loud when I'm talking and forget. But I guess just because I can see the scene, it sounds like something out of a Terry Gilliam flick or something.
But in a way, your instinct was right about Crystal City. The Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City, which is, part of that whole area. If you ever want to physically see the military-industrial complex, just go there at breakfast time, and you see it's all the defense contractors. Half the people there are in uniform, and the other half are, in $3,000 suits. It's the lobbyists and the defense contractors all having breakfast. That is the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
It's always an eye-opener.
Yeah. No, it's not an empire unless the guy in charge is wearing a cloak and shooting lightning out of his hands. Anything less than that is acceptable.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, no. Otherwise, if you were describing the capital of any other empire in the world, we'd go, wow, what a corrupt and decadent imperial court of rich welfare mongers that place is. You know what I mean? But to us, somehow this is the American way that we're just going to keep going like this,
Yeah, yeah.
It's acceptable.
It's funny. I was saying how, well, you see uniforms because they're on their way to work in the Pentagon, but most of the time, I would often comment on this. You wouldn't realize what a militarized state this is from just looking around, because you don't really see people in uniform. If you go to Moscow or even a lot of capitals around the world, you see a lot of people in military uniform. You don't here. I mean, you see people with short haircuts jogging around the Pentagon. We have all these military cities that are sort of hidden away, like Killeen, Texas, or lots of places around the country where they're military towns, but they're quite separate. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And it is kind of a, as they say with the professional army, not that I'm arguing for the draft, but with the professional so-called volunteer army, although they're pretty well paid. But after generations of that go by, and it's such a small percentage of the population, and they're out at these isolated places in the country away from everybody else, like you're talking about, it does kind of...
it's very inbred.
Yeah, and it makes them very separate from whoever they're defending. I know there's a big worry on the right now. I don't know if this could be a real concern, like historically speaking, but where because of all of the woke stuff, a bunch of older Americans have dropped out of the military, but now they're trying to recruit all immigrants to be in the military. But then
I heard, not the
and immigrants might be super patriotic, but then again, they might not be. I don't know.
1 in 4 Marines is now a Latino.
Yeah. But born here or born there?
Not sure. A lot of them not born here.
Yeah.
But
this was the fast track to citizenship, or was supposed to be in the Bush years and whatever. And, I'm not overly paranoid about this. I know that, most American Hispanics are just patriotic Americans. They're not here representing Mexico or anything like that. But
Yeah.
if you have a military that's essentially strangers, like where like most of them are not from here, then that does raise questions about how willing they would be to go places that previous armies would have refused, you know?
Yeah.
In terms of enforcing crackdowns on Americans. I mean,
yeah. Well, perhaps. Well, yeah, that's a good point.
so yeah, it could be that some of the paranoid are ahead of their time. It happens. You know what I mean?
Paranoid is someone who knows what's going on around him.
Yeah, exactly. All right, listen, well, I hope everyone will go to spoilsofwar.substack.com. This one is called The Birth of the Neocons, and check out all of Andrew's great books, including Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy, and the latest Spoils of War as well. And thank you very much for your time again. Good to talk to you.
Hey, thank you, Scott. Always a pleasure.
Have a good one.
Take care.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.